paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is a psychologist, Dr. Richard LaBrie, and we're going to talk about mass shootings. How you doing today, Rich?
I'm okay, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
Could you give us a little background?
I'm a clinical psychologist in Southern California, mostly treating clients for a variety of issues. But about 5-6 years ago, I got asked by a colleague who works in both research and federal contracting in terms of related to emergency management and a number of other areas at a company called Salis Solutions to do some research on active shooter prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery for the FAA, for airports in the country, and in collaboration with Department of Homeland Security. And so I became the senior advisor for the behavioral aspects of that. And so that's how I got involved with the research. And we went on to do research in terms of insider threats at airports and mental health awareness at airports. So the behavioral area of when people act out in a large setting like an airport was what I steeped myself in, and then the overlaps with mental health. And
going through New York airports with the TSA can be quite arduous. It wouldn't inspire me to shoot anybody, but it can be a very difficult process.
Yeah.
I've got as a source for mass shootings, I'm using the Gun Violence Archive, which describes a mass shooting as 4 people that are either injured or killed by a shooter. And there's a huge escalation. In 2018, there's 336 mass shootings, according to the Gun Archive definition. And in 2019, there's 417. But then in 2020, when the plague hits, it jumps to 610. And then in 2021, when we're really in the midst of the pandemic, it jumps to 690. And last year, there were 647 mass shootings. So we see this escalation that's kind of almost in keeping with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I like to do is discuss how mass shooting is defined by all of these organizations that research it, as well as the media. The term mass shooting has a high emotional impact on us. But your numbers there are reflecting any shooting that kills 4 people.
Kills or injures 4 people, yeah.
Yeah. So we have to take into account that these are, first of all, kills or injured, it might kill 1 person and injure 3. And these are in all environments. So this is including in homes, which is the highest number of killings are in homes, especially when you look at gun deaths, and schools, public places. So it's not separating out what we often think of when we think of mass shootings. We often think of Sandy Hook, or we think of Las Vegas, the ones that truly terrorize us, because these acts of violence happened in an unpredictable manner in a place that we usually should feel safe. But the majority of what you're quoting, the majority of those incidents are crime-related, felony-related, family-related, violence person on person, which doesn't diminish it. They're horrible outcomes. But I like to look at the statistics for that on one hand, and then say the FBI statistics on active shooters. And they define active shooters as, by a similar definition, where if 3 or 4 or more people are killed or injured, but they happen in public spaces or confined public spaces with a goal to kill as many people as possible randomly, which is much different than, say, what we'd call a familicide, where a family member comes home and shoots their family and maybe kills themselves. And unfortunately, those numbers are much higher than the public mass shootings. I'm going to make sure I state it right. In the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, they talk about how in one of the years that one of the groups looked at, when they included all mass shootings, there were something like 463 in the year they were looking at, in one of the recent years. But when they pulled out public mass shootings, there were only 10. And so it becomes an interesting dialogue with the media. If we come out and say there are 463 mass shootings, it feels like America is collapsing in terms of the terror aspect of being in public and being safe. 10 is still horrible, don't get me wrong, but it's much different than 463. And this is what's making the debate, I think, very confusing for people, and making it difficult to figure out what laws work, what laws don't work, what changes should be made in terms of gun ownership, in terms of threat assessment, in terms of mental health awareness and treatment. And also getting any of us to really pay attention to the nuances of boring statistics is pretty hard, because these are all over the place, as you've seen.
One thing I've noticed is that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between a state's gun control and the number of mass shootings.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. The states that really clamp down on gun ownership nonetheless have a number of mass shootings. I've noticed that in the statistics. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. So according to that same FBI, no, this is actually Rockefeller Institute for Government, and it was overlapped with some of the FBI stuff. California has about 40 million people. And according to their data, 15.5% of the shootings in the years that they covered, it was a 50-year period. The Rockefeller Institute covered mass shootings from 1966 to 2016. And I believe they were looking more at the active shooter style, the public mass shootings, okay? Not the all mass shootings. So California, which has some of the strictest, if not the strictest gun laws, had 15.9%. Interestingly, when you go over to the other state that has the strongest gun laws, New Jersey, which has about a quarter of the population, about 9 or 10 million people, they only had 1.1, let's say 1.2% of the mass shootings over the 50 years. So 2 states both have strong gun laws, but wildly different. Something looks like it's working in New Jersey. Something looks like it's not working as much in California. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to compare populations, so we had kind of a more of a per capita. And so what happens is Governor Newsom referred to a study that was very good for us to hear, which is that California's per capita gun deaths are actually low. We're 43rd in the country in terms of simply gun deaths, all gun deaths. So it's working. Strong gun laws work in terms of all gun deaths, but they don't seem to statistically or materially impact public, random victim mass shootings. And that's what's really important to me, because the FBI data actually points to other areas that are driving public mass shootings that don't overlap much with gun laws. And we'll get into that too. I can go through those statistics with you. So you're absolutely right. There's not a lot of correlation with strong or weak gun laws. Oh, and let me add one more thing. There is a correlation between gun density and active shooters or public mass shooters. So there is some overlap, but it doesn't seem to impact very much because public mass shootings are so rare that the statistics can't grab onto whether the laws are impacting. But density certainly seems to play a role. So further confounding this and making it confusing.
You were talking about the FBI delineating certain explanations for this phenomena. Could you speak to that?
So interestingly, between the FBI and also the Rockefeller Institute. So when we look at mass shootings, public mass shootings, over the 50-year period of 1966 to 2016, 1,141 people were killed, 1,385 injured. But over 50 years, the same 50 years, if we look at all gun deaths, there's several 100,000. So right there, you have a statistical challenge, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people killed by guns in 50 years. You have 1,141 killed in the public mass shootings that are talked about more in the news than general gun deaths. So the language is a little bit off. We're at about, I think, 48,000 gun deaths per year, and a good 2/3 of them at least are by suicide. So what the FBI found when they studied a smaller sliver, they studied 13 years, the year 2000 to 2013. And they did factor analyses by interviewing family members or talking to the shooter if they were still alive. And what they found was the highest factor among the shooters, 49% of them had experienced interpersonal or workplace grievances. Only 2% purchased firearms illegally, or 6% stole them. 5% acquired the gun at the scene, which is a complicated action to figure out. 75% of the shooters had legally acquired the guns. So strong gun laws or weak gun laws didn't seem to make a difference there. When they broke down whether mental health played an impact, 25% of the shooters had some kind of diagnosis. But as we know in my field, simply having a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or even psychosis doesn't mean you're going to commit an act of violence. And they also, in either the RAND or one of the other studies, they made a really good point that often the shooter was assessed after the shooting, and the shooting itself impacted their symptoms such that they acquired a diagnosis. And so that may inflate the number of whether there's a mental health diagnosis with a shooter. However, 62% were impacted by symptoms of mental health distress, which makes sense. And only 0.5% suffered from psychosis. So the strongest number was interpersonal and workplace distress or actions against them. And another strong number was there were past suicidal actions in about half of the shooters. And those that could be interviewed afterwards, 90% of them displayed suicidal ideation. Actually, even some of the ones who killed themselves or were killed.
Well, a lot of them kill themselves after they shoot other people.
Yes, right. Or they wish to be killed by a cop, suicide by
Yeah,
cop.
suicide by cop.
So I don't know. I kind of went all over the map there with the factor analysis. Did that cover what you asked me?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, we'll get into maybe warning signs, but there are a significant amount of
Do you want to speak to any more symptomology? Speak more.
Yeah. So let me kind of go back here. So feelings of persecution and humiliation were seen as coming from whatever the interpersonal grievance or distress or actions against were, either at home or in the workplace. We also see in later shootings more ideological reasons. So with the political divide or overall long-term like cultural ideologies that become more intense or maladaptive. We see that in some shooters. So really, it was filtered down to personal grievance, workplace grievance, real and perceived persecution and humiliation, and ideological reasons mixed with increasing personal stressors. But really, none of the data zeroes in on a specific mental health issue as a diagnosis. It's more the global concept of stress or distress, personal conflict, and also areas where people's lives start to fall apart financially or for other reasons, interpersonally, romantically. Andre Simmons, an FBI investigator, had some really good quotes about this. He said, and I'm quoting Andre Simmons, "The active shooter tends more often than not to be motivated by a deeply personal grievance, tinged with feelings of persecution and humiliation, real and perceived, whereas terrorists are oftentimes going to be motivated by more ideological reasons." And the FBI also added workplace grievances into the deeply personal grievance quote.
There was quite a run at post offices over the years. And I always wondered about that. And I knew someone in high school that struck me as somewhat homicidal. And he became a U.S. postal worker. And now he's retired. And he didn't shoot anybody. But I was thinking, that be good to keep an eye on that guy.
Right. Well, you speak to something that there's a lot of good data on trying to compare whether there are predictive behaviors or just behaviors beforehand that don't necessarily predict but are worthy of threat assessment. And the threat assessment part of it is where all the data seems to land, that there are some consistent cries for help or messaging that come out of shooters that, if it's caught by family members or by mental health clinicians or schools or any group that has eyes on people, then a threat assessment can be done, an intervention can be done that can sidestep the violence.
And what
Red
would
flag
be, go ahead, sorry.
red flag laws are a good example of that. So this is a law that does seem to be making a difference. And a red flag law is they only exist in a handful of states so far. It allows a family member or other person in the environment of a person to express concern to the police, who can then get a court order to remove guns from that person's house or that person's possession. Maybe not forever, just temporarily until the threat passes. One of
And
the
what would
challenges, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
What would be those telltale signs?
Um, Postings on the internet, and expressed personal grievances, erratic behavior, an over focus on guns and weaponry. Um, Sometimes fantasy expressed about a particular kind of act of violence that they might commit. And we've seen that sometimes they come true because they're part of a long-term planning. We know that people don't just snap and um, commit at least public active shooting um, scenarios. Now, how that plays out in terms of family violence, I don't know. I don't know that data as much. That those sometimes are not planned out, I believe, but the mass shootings that we talk about in public are highly planned, is what the data shows. So you know, there's some data on that I have that's interesting, that people will confront or talk to the family member sometimes. I have some numbers. Bear with me here. Sorry. So noticed behavior. So now these are kind of different studies, so they don't add up to 100% in terms of the data, but 83% of those who noticed issues in a person in their environment, they did address the shooter. 83%. However, the shooting happened anyway. 54% of some other group that was interviewed did nothing, and 41% reported to law enforcement. Now, this is before red flag laws, 2000 to 2013. So what I'm seeing in the data is that communities are struggling with this. A lot of people don't know what a red flag law is. They don't know how to execute it. They don't even know that it exists. Sometimes law enforcement's overwhelmed, or there's a gap in terms of how to respond, and there are not enough states with red flag laws, but they do help. So this is an example of a law regarding guns that can help stop the public shootings.
You had said that 41% in that one study had been reported to law enforcement.
Yeah, right.
And that didn't seem to really do any good. I mean,
yeah, because if there wasn't a red flag law in place, then, and if that particular law enforcement agency doesn't have a prong of their organization that can do a threat assessment, then not much would happen. Now, if it were today, say in California, and I were to report something about somebody, I think there's a higher chance that something would happen, that police would come, or a pet team might talk to the family, which is a psychological emergency response team. Usually it's a clinician, like a social worker or a psychologist, and a police officer. Come interview the family, maybe talk to the person, and if there was enough being presented that would warrant a court order, they could go get a court order, execute the red flag, take away the guns, and then make suggestions for mental health treatment. And that's a diversion. And I think we've seen in one report that the red flag laws had they believe had diverted more than 50 mass shootings. Now they could be either family-based mass shootings or public. We don't know what the person would do.
there seems to be something about the United States that mass produces mass shooters. Canada has basically the same gun density as the United States, but yet they have very few mass shootings. What is it in this culture that compels people to engage in mass shootings compared to other cultures?
Well, my pitch, I'm going to be doing a continuing education class on this topic, and my pitch to clinicians is that if it's interpersonal grievances, workplace grievances, um, basically harm, interpersonal harm, then we can make a difference as clinicians in the treatment room, and we can make a difference as members of the public in looking at, does America have a higher level of toxicity in its intensity compared to Canada? Are our social structures safe and firmly rooted? And are Canada's more rooted? And there's a great quote about this. Let me go down to it. So this is by Kylie Zempel, quoting Thane Belomo from some of the research that I did for the last presentation. So what they wrote was, the thing that has fundamentally changed is that we have discarded those regulating social institutions that have helped people understand their value and place in this world for thousands of years. Their decline is not just mirrored in the rise of mass shootings, but more broadly in a host of statistics that reveal an epidemic of despair. And in some of the interviews, I pulled 3 interviews for this other presentation. The idea of despair was really there in 3 of these people, 2 of whom were shooters, and one was a spy who leaked information from the Navy, a young kid. He was only in his 20s. And in all of them, and these 3 people are alive and in jail, they said that, here's why I was struggling. Here were the signals that I sent. And in the investigations, they were able to corroborate the signals that were sent with their peers that, yes, this person was struggling. They did say these things. So perhaps it's that America's structure leads to more of an epidemic of despair compared to Canada. And I don't know enough about Canada to speak to that, but
But I looked at other countries too, and no one even comes close to the United States.
exactly.
And it's the culture of despair. What are the constituents of this culture of despair? Do you just want to take a guess at it as a clinician?
Yeah, I mean, I have to overlap it with, social patterns and I think economic patterns is some data that pointed to until recently, when we've seen a little bit of an uptick, wages have been flat in the United States since the 70s. And this is according to Robert Reich, I think he was the Secretary of Labor, and his studies. When accounted for, factored in with inflation, inflation went up, wages would go up a little bit, but when inflation was put in there, wages stayed relatively flat. Right now in Southern California, if I wanted to go rent in the Pasadena area, a studio, right? Pretty much one room and a bathroom with a little kitchenette. They're upwards of $3,000 a month.
It's as bad as New York.
Yeah. And then you peel off to some other, Seattle and other big cities, and it's not that much better. So, I think people are being squeezed. I think certain social programs have been, diminished. And one thing I noticed in industrial organizational psychology, which is not my specialty, but I follow it a little bit, is that, we noticed in the mid 19th century, that management styles needed to change. That the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s, concept of controlling and belittling labor to get them to perform was not working. And that's what we saw in the post office shootings. Is, you know, they came to a stop because they changed their management style. They were forced to. Um, but I am astonished at times when I hear certain stories about big corporations these days using management styles that harken back to, you know, early 1900s.
Like
You know,
Taylorism.
yeah, there was a worker on an Amazon floor that died, and his body was there for a couple hours before anybody, you know, responded because of the people's fear of retaliation, because of the pace they have to work at, and um, and I also talk to clients who work in the film industry where their lifestyle is being impacted by this sort of time pressure and financial pressure of the TV and film industry, and then how that translates into management styles that are not so modern, not so nuanced. So that's my riff on where some of this stuff might be coming from.
It seems to me, and over the course of my life, that corporations are squeezing their workers much more so than they've been squeezed before. I can remember if you got a job, healthcare was generally provided for you, and even a low-level job. And now healthcare is exponentially rising, and there aren't a lot of employers that will offer healthcare at this point, which puts the onus on the individual. And
Yeah,
I could see how just being squeezed in various ways would produce that despair. And and is that more so done in the United States than it is in these other countries? This creating this despair because of material means?
that's probably a question for a different specialist, but anecdotally, it's what people come through my door for psychotherapy, carrying with them sometimes. Uh, and there were trends that started, I don't know, a couple of decades ago, maybe two to three, where we would see companies only offer part-time jobs. So you would be, let's say, get a job at a certain place and only be given 19 hours a week because the threshold for healthcare was 20 or 21 hours. And it was a clever way they could avoid that benefit.
We see it in academia where people are made associate professors. I have a friend that's been an associate professor forever. So that his institution doesn't really have to pay him as they would a normal professor or a tenured professor. With serial killers, they've got like three common denominators. They're bedwetters, they're fire starters, and they like to torture animals. Is there common denominators with mass shooters that are like that?
Yeah, it's less personality based and more about behaviors that point more to threat assessments. So behaviors that were taken from these overlapping studies, making threats on the internet, obsessively playing the role of shooter in online games. And I want to speak to that in a second. A history of mental illness, buying large numbers of firearms, acquiring lots of ammunition, a victim of bullying, a loner, and stressors in life increasing. Now, that list is not hierarchical, and none are weighed more than the others. And they all have issues, because you might have all of those 8 behaviors and never do anything. So prediction is not possible. And that's several, I think the Rand Corporation, as well as the FBI, and most studies point to that. Prediction is not possible. But if you see these 8 behaviors, it is an invitation to do a threat assessment, because threat assessment is the recommended intervention. But the American Psychological Association had several articles. They did a book of collected studies on mass shooters, and this is more leaning towards the public mass shooter than the family or home or criminally based, gang member or felony murder. That violent video games, and when kids play violent video games, it did not correlate with an increase in risk. You would have to see these behaviors collectively going together. So there was a slight uptick in certain populations in terms of violent video games overlapping with violent behavior, but it was very specific, and I don't think there's enough data to call it anything yet. But go ahead.
Well, a number of people have surmised or extrapolated that violent video games is causing this enhanced violence. But according to the statistics that you're referring to, that doesn't seem to be it. There doesn't seem to be a correlation.
No, there's not enough data on that. Waldron and Scarp from 2017 described how one Columbine killer was from a stable home and the other was from an authoritarian home. So even the style of parenting of these younger shooters was confounded. I mean, here were 2 people who teamed up to kill in Columbine. And in the post-assessment, one of their homes was considered stable with good parenting, and the other one had authoritarian parenting, which is not considered stable.
And
so,
go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, so Weingarten Ferguson, 2017, found that the concepts that were unsupported were violent video games, bad homes, and bullying, they said. Although in other studies, the bullying does show up, because if the response to the bullying turns into a significant grievance and with mental health symptoms, then bullying does become a factor.
What's your surmise on, and I'm going to revisit this. There were so many shootings with postal employees. I mean, there's the term going postal.
Yeah.
I don't understand why postal employees would be susceptible to mass shooting.
Yeah, I looked into that a bit, and some of the studies said that it caught so much media attention, but when they dug down into the statistics, it wasn't as much of it was focused through the media more than through the actual events. There were other shootings that were happening. And then a psychologist I talked to, who's since passed away, said that he did a little consulting on that, and that it turned out to be the outdated punitive management system seemed to be at play in some of these. And it was, it was solved. You don't hear about those anymore, and they're not happening. And so I do have some more data on that, but I don't recall it because that was from 5 years ago.
So it's not related to people putting the wrong zip codes on letters.
No, or tired life from working. But I think it's similar to the corporate stuff we've been talking about. The people were just pushed too much. But that alone doesn't cause it. What we know is that people get pushed, in a certain environment, and then something else happens, and they miss a car payment, and then their credit goes down, and then let's say this is all theoretical. Let's say then they start drinking a little bit because they're worried, and then they park that car in a place where it gets booted because they're not thinking straight, and then it's $1,200 to get the car out of the impound, and they already didn't pay the car payment, right? So they come home and they're drinking more, and they get in an argument with their spouse, and then they're having trouble at home, and then it escalates. Then their boss is acting in a punitive, overly reactive way, maybe, or maybe in a way that's rational given how the person is acting. And these things collide, and at some point it just explodes, and the person aims their grievance wherever they decide to aim it.
You had said earlier that this isn't generally a person that just snaps, that they've been thinking about this for a while.
Yeah. Planning behaviors can start, according to this FBI study, they found that one person began their planning, and also there were signs 25 months beforehand, so 2 years. And yeah, it's not, and this is more for the like coordinated mass shootings. Now, again, somebody, if they have a gun in their house and they're suicidal and maybe homicidal and get into a fight, they could wake up and hit their limit and take out their whole family. That's a different scenario, which is important for me that the public know.
You talked about those 8 variables that were integral. Now, are all 8 involved, or you said it wasn't hierarchical?
Right. No, I mean, I think they don't all 8 have to be involved with every person. It's more like of the 63 shooters that they studied from 2000 to 2013. That's what they found. Usually on the news, we hear about the more terrorizing public shooting incidents. And by terrorizing, I mean they fall into the definition of a terror event, meaning they impact our feeling of safety in places when we usually should expect to feel safe, which is different from a family that was killed down the street in their house based on a gang incident, a felony, or a murder-suicide. Both are horrible. They affect us differently. And what the RAND Corporation is saying here, looking at the data, is that these would both need different firearm policy analyses in order to create information, legislation, or behavior change in society. And so I'm always pushing for a multi-pronged look at this stuff. Because if we just say very generalized emotional things like, let's take away every gun from every person, well, sure, but there's 300 million guns here. And how are we going to do that without creating a civil war? And how do you operationalize that, right?
And a
So,
lot of Americans think happiness is a warm gun. So
right.
you're not going to get their guns.
Yeah, it's too complicated to expect that. And then so people will point to Australia or other places where it was more effective. Well, it's a much smaller country. There's a lot less guns. And then also you have places like Switzerland, which I believe has high gun ownership because people are conscripted into, they have to serve in the military, and then they're able to keep their weapons. But again, the social programs there, I believe, lower the elements of despair. It's also more of a homogenous cultural, foundation in the country. So there's likely less conflict that happens interculturally within the social system. One of the highest demographics of suicidality is white males, which is counter to the idea of privilege and dominant social paradigms. But that could point to maybe the pressure some of that population might be carrying in their personal lives or work lives. I don't know.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Native Americans have a high suicide rate,
Uh-huh.
and I'm not aware of one of them being involved in a mass shooting, which
Right.
is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah. And whether that's access to guns or um, whether there's a suicidal drive that's more internalized. You know, sometimes when we're depressed, we internalize it, we blame ourselves, we aim it at ourselves, and then sometimes we express it externally. And when you add a grievance that comes from outside, some people then respond by externalizing it. And so perhaps there's something there.
I've heard it said that depression is anger turned inward. And I know that there's a number of different definitions of depression, and I know a lot of it can be neurochemistry. But I think that there's something to that. Depression is anger turned inwards.
Mm-hmm.
So with these mass shooters, we have, I believe, anger turned inwards with because a lot of them have such high rates of suicide or suicide ideation. But then ultimately, that anger fulminates outward,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Some of the interviews here talked about there was one of the articles here was a breakdown of like 23 manifestos. And the manifestos will show more of the grandiosity, the externalization, the anger, the narcissism. And it's almost like there's a toggle between the internalized depression, the externalized narcissism and grandiosity. I can fix this kind of mentality that toggles back and forth. And then so they go and express the anger through the violence, but then end up killing themselves or want to be killed.
I could see how narcissism could be play an integral role in with mass shooters.
And it could overlap with grievances too, because we know that narcissism is usually, I mean, healthy narcissism is our need to self-focus, to adapt and to protect ourselves. And when you go all the way up to say malignant narcissism, or just narcissistic behavior, it usually comes from a wound to the self-esteem system. And so they need to gather more resources towards themselves to protect that wound. And if you think about it, that's easy for that to be connected to grievances. Someone hurt me over and over again at work or in a relationship, and then externalize.
It doesn't appear to me that mass shooters are outright sociopaths or psychopaths. They seem to have other psychiatric morbidities, but from my research, they often don't display that type of antisocial behavior.
Yeah, I think a sociopath, if they were to kill a bunch of people, it would be for their own gain and they wouldn't want to die afterwards. And a psychopath might do it for some kind of distorted, internal set of maybe stimulation. Who knows? I'm not as much of a learned person on psychopaths.
So you've got these attributes that seem to align, that are the constituents of a mass shooter. And what's interesting to me, and as I just said, there isn't like major antisocial behavior with a lot of these people. It's just these various life variables aligning themselves, coming together, and ultimately creating something that's very malignant, that wasn't there prior to those life variables.
Yeah, although the predictive part of it is mentioned, right? Previous violent behavior can predict future. So some of the people had demonstrated violent behavior beforehand, especially in the global mass shooting numbers, right? Those who have committed crimes in the past, or have felony records. But yeah, it's less predictable with the public shooters. The actual sociopathic behavior happens in the moment in the shooting, and they may not have any of that beforehand, but they may show hints of it in their languaging. So these differences that we're seeing in how all this fits together is said so well in the Rand study. It says systemic biases in the types of incidents that receive widespread media coverage affect the number of incidents that are counted, but might also misrepresent the relative characteristics of the offenders, the victims, or the communities involved. And so it reminds me of, like, in Michael Moore's film Bowling for Columbine, he talked about how there was a massive rise, 60 or 80% rise in news coverage of murders during the 90s, especially the late 90s, I think. But there was actually something like a 16% drop in murders that actually happened, according to the FBI. And so we see that a lot. So the pressure to sell a news story, if somebody beheads somebody or something really fantastical, it makes us feel like the world's exploding. But then you look at crime statistics, and for that whole decade, they might have been dropping. So I think this statement by Rand speaks to that we have to be careful of what the media covers versus what our need for effective legislation and communication and education are.
I'm a big fan of Ernest Becker, and he wrote a book called Denial of Death. And the central thesis of that book is that if people, the closer people come to their death, or the more they're reminded of their death, there's something malevolent that can occur. And this is kind of an interesting study. This was the first study. There's been 175 studies that have shown that Becker's thought is right. But there were 22 Tucson, Arizona judges, and 11 of them were the control group. And then 11 of them, they had to go through a couple of things. Please briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your own death arouses in you. And then the next thing was jot down as specifically as you can what you think will happen to you as you physically die and once you are physically dead. So half the judges had answered those questions and half of them didn't. And they were all of them were basically given the same case. It was a prostitution case, a mock prostitution case. And generally, the fine for the case would be around $50, or for that offense would be $50. But the judges in the control group averaged about $50. That was what their bond was. But the 11 judges that had to be thought about their deaths daily and wrote about their deaths, they find that bond for a case of prostitution was $455. So obviously these judges that were reminded of their death became bellicose. And my thoughts on it are, if you look at Becker's thoughts superimposed on mass shooters, and in 2019 there were 417 mass shooters, but that number, as soon as the pandemic starts, and during the pandemic, we're all watching television, and the television is basically telling us that we're going to die, and it's talking about other people that are dying. You could not escape thinking about your death during the pandemic. So in 2019, there were 417 mass shooters, according to the definition by the Gun Violence Archive. But in 2020, when the plague hits, there's 610. And then in 2021, kind of a lot of people have been subjected to a year of thinking about their deaths. It jumps to 690. It goes from 610 to 690. And then in 2022, where things are starting to just kind of come back to normalcy, it drops to 647. And then they're surmising that it's going to drop to 632 in 2023. So Becker's thought really fits in with the rise of mass shootings during the pandemic. So I was wondering if I know that you're not that familiar with Becker, but I was wondering what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I want to add to it a little bit. So one of the things we knew in our field, most of us who did psychotherapy continued working, and our workload increased during the pandemic. So we had contact with our clients and what was happening. And I also collaborated with social workers, and those increases do correlate with murders in the home and domestic violence. Kids were no longer at school. People were no longer going to work in the same way. So you didn't have eyes on people, especially the vulnerable, like kids. And so the violations, child abuse skyrocketed, and domestic violence skyrocketed because people were no longer protected. They were trapped in the home with the abuser. And so the numbers you're quoting are for mass shootings of all types.
Yes.
But in 2019, there were only 28 active shooters in public. 2019. That believe that number dropped in 2020 during the lockdown. You didn't hear because now, so that's the different definition, the active shooter in public versus the mass shooting, 4 or more people killed or injured. So yeah, when we got trapped together in our homes, the vulnerable, unprotected people in society suffered or were killed. And it was pretty horrible. And I think we're going to be seeing the impacts of that for a couple generations.
But not only that, crime went up, and just regular homicides went up too. So
yeah,
there was a tremendous spike in all crimes during the plague. And what you're saying is very pragmatic. And when I'm talking about Becker, it's a little more ethereal, but there have been 175 studies that have used that modus operandi that was used for the judges. And in every case, when people are reminded of their death, they become bellicose.
Yeah, I forgot to support that in my answer. And that correlates with other studies of different, when we're negatively, cognitively and emotionally primed by questions like that, then we tend to make more negative decisions or have more depressive attitude or take a less optimistic stance. So I'm sure there's more than 175. I think that would be supported by cognitive and emotional psychologist experts.
Well, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast and talking about a very optimistic subject, mass shootings. I tend to specialize in optimistic subjects. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with us?
Yeah, I want to just say that anything that I've said in no way is meant to diminish the horrific impact of gun violence or simplify it. In fact, I'm trying to make it less simple because I think it's a complex issue. And I think we need to continue to look at strong gun laws and red flag laws, but we also need to look at interpersonal and workplace distress and the overall despair that people are feeling in the public as drivers of especially public mass shootings, but also all shootings. If we can find ways to reduce some of these stressors overall as a society, and I think we'll see some of these numbers go down. And I also want people to keep in mind that if you dig into a lot of the statistics, overall mass gun deaths are relatively flat if you keep widening over into maybe like a 50-year pattern. The rise is happening more in the public mass shootings. But the numbers will always rise because our population rises. So it's also important to look at per capita deaths. And that's where you'll see more, some of it's a little flatter than the news will report to us. And by per capita, meaning how many deaths per 100,000 people. Because I'm concerned that we do get, like Becker says, if we watch the news and we feel negative, then we take a negative stance, or we take a kind of an impulsive stance on what the solutions are. And I think it's important to try to keep those things in balance and double check our facts compared to what the media reports, and try to care for each other more. And I think the deaths will go down.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast, and have yourself a great day.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on.